Okay, we need to talk about Iran. The world would be a better place if there was nothing compelling you to click on this video. But here we are. The Strait of Hormuz, as many of you know by now, is of critical importance for the transportation of oil for the Middle East, specifically for Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Iran, and Bahrain. About 25% of the world's oil supply goes through that little strip of water, and while it's only 25% of the world's total oil traffic, 80% of it ends up in Asia, so it is of particular concern for them, which is why places like South Korea were so reactive to news coming out of the strait. The freedom of travel on the seas is a central principle to international law and international trade. It was cemented after a dispute between the Portuguese and the Dutch East India Trading Company in 1603. To defend his party's actions, the Dutch legal scholar Hugo Grotius coined the term mare liberum, or freedom of the seas, in 1609. In his later book, The Law of War and Peace, which would further expand on this principle, he cites an old Roman jurist, Celsus, who states, "To all men belong the use of the sea." It is evident that this principle has an ancient tradition in Western law. The primary argument for this doctrine is that no one country can own a sea, and as such, they should be free for all to use. This doctrine protects travelers and eases the transportation of goods from country to country. Waterways are shipping highways. They allow the largest amount of goods and people to travel quickly. No one mode of transportation matches their capability. Nearly everything in our lives are either made or made of things manufactured in other countries. And despite the very real problems this sometimes causes, such as things like supply chain vulnerability and certain job instability, we are better off for it. People will look at the few instances of the global network not working properly and point to that as a reason as to why things should be different, forgetting that the only reason things are as good as they are in the first place is because of those very same systems that they are desperately trying to tear down. The United States and the rest of the world enjoy countless benefits granted by the single principle of freedom of the seas, so much so that any threat to it should be seen as a threat to our very way of life. The world's nations have collectively decided over the past 4 centuries that guaranteeing and protecting this principle is in the best interest of all. Outside of instances of war, in which things like blockades and embargoes are legitimate tactics, it is rare for it to be the policy of a nation to interrupt this practice. While oil prices affect the vast majority of us directly at the fuel pump, they also operate as a tax on every product we buy. Everything needs to be transported, and almost everything needs to be transported multiple times. Every time a good travels, the price of the fuel to move it affects the price of that good. A threat that increases the price of oil makes simply existing more expensive. Some of you may think to yourselves that the United States has tons of oil, so much so that it should be insulated from those shortages overseas. And while we are the largest oil producer in the world, just because we have oil does not mean that it will stay here. If the price changes globally, our local producers will be incentivized to sell to other countries that are willing to pay more for it. The only way to keep it here is to pay a higher price. A rise in the price will fill the pockets of our poor and starving oil barons, but it will do nothing to help your cost of living. There are literally hundreds of strategic waterways around the world that, should the local nation impose control over, would severely hamper trade, which, you guessed it, would make things more expensive for all of us. Some examples are the Strait of Malacca in Southeast Asia, which has even more oil shipping through it than Hormuz does, the Taiwanese Strait between Taiwan and China, through which nearly half of the world's shipping tankers pass, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which needs to be traversed by nearly every ship traveling from Europe to Asia through the Suez Canal, just to name a few. Nations cutting off the free flow of goods and access to critically important shipping choke points is exceedingly rare, and seen as a serious escalation. Our waterways are the modern equivalent of the Silk Road. Transporting goods from Europe to Asia was dangerous. It required relationships and agreements with many different authorities along the route, and at any point, travelers could be under threat caused by dramatic power shifts in the region. The creation of the Silk Road created an economic explosion as traveling became safer, faster, and cheaper. These are the same principles and benefits caused by our open waterways today. I bring all of this up to highlight the catastrophic miscalculation that failing to secure the Strait of Hormuz during our foray into Iran is. I don't know. This may not even be over by the time the video is released, but you get the point. For decades, it has been incredibly obvious to anyone that has known anything about this area that securing the Strait of Hormuz should be a top priority for any wishing to get militarily involved with Iran. It is unquestionable that Iran has been given an unintended gift, which is the knowledge that it can at any time hold the entire world hostage. Regardless of all other aspects of the conflict, this alone has been the largest failure of the United States. A Pandora's box that threatens the entire world, something that will, till the world is no longer dependent on oil, haunt us all. At any time in the future, during any negotiation, for any reason whatsoever, Iran can threaten to close the strait, something that it may have been able to do in the past. But now, everyone has proof as to the amount of damage that will occur should they follow through. On top of the added pressure the threat of closing Hormuz will have on future negotiations, there will also undoubtedly be outside pressure from uninvolved nations trying to influence things in Iran's favor, if for no other reason than to just keep them from closing the strait again. Now, to be fair, closing the strait does negatively affect Iran, but the cost to the rest of the world is asymmetrically larger. Another catastrophic result of this whole ordeal has been that not only do we all know what the closure of the strait will look like, but we know that Iran actually has the capability to do it. Big boats can close access to waterways, sure, but so too can a few militiamen on its shores with rockets and drones. Like all things in modern warfare, the cost differential between these two things is stark. This new threat has significantly tilted all future negotiations in Iran's favor. The fact that the mighty American military was unable or unwilling to force open the strait means that no other individual force would be able to either. One of the many downsides to all of this has been that the conflict has greatly benefited Russia. To soften the blow of oil not being able to flow through the strait, the United States temporarily removed the sanctions on Russian oil, meaning that it could be officially purchased by the free world, at a time when the price was about 50% higher than it is normally. This allowed them to make crucial billions in only a few months, which will undoubtedly be used to cause more damage in Ukraine. This was a direct consequence of the strait being closed. I am sure that I am not the only one that has been frustrated by the back and forth nature of the status of the strait. Something to keep in mind is that there are actually two major military forces in Iran: the Iranian military and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. Iran has a president who is more or less in control of their military, but it also has an Ayatollah, which is the religious leader of the country who supersedes the president. The previous Ayatollah was assassinated at the start of the conflict, and the current Ayatollah is his son, who has not been seen in public since the start of all of this. He lost his father, mother, wife, and sister in the same strike. By all accounts, the previous Ayatollah was the moderate option. His son, Mojtaba, was more radical and highly connected to the IRGC even before a large portion of his family was killed. It should be no surprise what feelings he has towards the United States, and the IRGC now report directly to him. Technically, an agreement reached by the Iranian government and the military should also bind the IRGC, but in practice, this does not seem to be the case. Because the government does not have direct control over them, they cannot officially command the IRGC to follow an agreement they have signed. This might explain why we were told 10 or 20 times that the strait was open, only to find out moments later that it was in fact not. These instances may be able to be explained by either assuming the US administration was lying, the Iranian government was lying, or perhaps there actually was a deal, but the Iranian government was not able to control the specific forces keeping the strait closed at that time. Besides the fact that there are essentially two military forces that need to be dealt with, there are also all of the terror proxies that Iran funds. Funding terrorists, something I wish Pakistan would have learned by now, only gives you a limited amount of control over them. So while the Iranian government might not want to close the strait and might even be ordering its proxies to keep it open, any one of them at any time could just decide to close it, even to the detriment of their benefactor. While they do not have a direct influence over the strait, the Lebanon-based Hezbollah has been made a crucial component to this conflict. And despite what you may have been told by the morally bankrupt, they are in fact a terrorist organization. The United States and Iran have come to an agreement recently, one that at the time of writing is already under threat. Who could possibly have guessed that all of this would have kicked off right after market close on a Friday? Nevertheless, I think the intent of the memorandum is relatively obvious once we break it down into the things that go into effect as of signing, which more or less return things to how they were before the conflict started, with some important caveats, and the second half, which contains all of the things that still need to be negotiated, which as far as I can tell, contain the things that this conflict was actually started over. The things that go into effect as soon as the memorandum is signed are as follows. All military operations in the area, including in Lebanon, are halted by both parties and their allies. They also agree not to begin, or even threaten to begin, any new operations against each other. The US will immediately begin removing its blockade and will finish that withdrawal within 30 days. Iran will make arrangements to facilitate the safe passage of vessels through Hormuz. It will do this with no charges for 60 days only. Iran will take means necessary to remove any obstacles, including mines, within 30 days. The US Treasury shall issue waivers that allow the sale of Iranian oil until the sanctions on said oil are removed. The US will make all frozen and restricted assets in US control available for use by the Central Bank of Iran. After the already stated sections have been completed, the negotiations for the remaining components will begin. So the strait goes back to how things were, the military operations stop, Iran gets to sell its oil sanction-free, and it gets access to its frozen funds. Except, the deal specifically states that Iran isn't able to charge fees for 60 days, presumably meaning that after that 60 days, they can. And while the deal-making process is subject to extensions, the fee-free time period is not. The military operations against Iran stop, which is more or less how things were before, except now they get to muzzle Israel. This puts immediate strain on our relationship, which is to Iran's benefit. Do not be mistaken, the repercussions of this agreement mean a great deal more to Israel than they do to us. If they feel they are being left in a more vulnerable state, then they will naturally do something about it. Iran also gets to sell its oil to the rest of the free world, sanction-free, which goes even further than the Obama-era JCPOA nuclear deal, which Trump scrapped in 2018. The sanctions lifted by the JCPOA were only partially and conditionally lifted. The proposed waivers would effectively allow Iran to sell their oil sanction-free until they are officially lifted. Iran also gets access to all of its frozen assets, which in the US add up to around $12 billion. And over time, it will gain access to its frozen assets globally, which will end up being around $100 billion. So Iran gets access to billions of dollars, a new fee mechanism, and the ability to sell its oil sanction-free while the US gets oil flowing again, which was the case before our attack, and it was without any fees. Now, here are the things that both sides agree to start negotiating on once all of the previous stuff goes into effect. Both sides agree to respect each other's sovereignty and refrain from interfering with internal affairs. They both agree to work out a final deal within 60 days, which is infinitely extendable as long as both sides agree. The US will work out a mechanism with other Gulf nations to establish a reconstruction plan with Iran worth at least $300 billion. The US will remove all sanctions on Iran which will also include all UN Security Council sanctions. It is of note that this is singled out as of critical importance to Iran. Iran promises not to procure a nuclear device, which, as an official signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, was its official stance before the conflict. So in essence, nothing on this front has officially changed. Both parties will work out what will happen to the current stockpile of enriched nuclear material, and they will also discuss the amount of enrichment Iran is able to achieve. It should also be of note that this is singled out as of critical importance to the United States. Both sides agree that once the deal is finalized, they will both work to maintain the status quo, one in which Iran does not attain a nuclear device, as well as stay within the confines of the enrichment levels agreed upon, and in which the US does not impose more sanctions. And finally, the deal will be made legal through a binding UN resolution. This half of the memorandum is the most difficult to achieve, but also the most consequential. As I stated earlier, the half of the memorandum that goes into effect upon signing essentially returns things to the state before the conflict started, though it is weighted heavily in Iran's favor. The second half is weighted in such a way that would almost certainly guarantee Iran's ascension to a fully developed nation, which, with the current government in charge, could have catastrophic consequences. Don't get me wrong, I want nothing more than for Iran to get to this stage, but having it happen with the same regime that has been funding terrorist proxies and murdering its own protesters en masse would be incredibly destabilizing to the region and, regardless of our opinion, a direct threat to Israel. To put it into perspective, Iran's GDP before the conflict was around $300 billion. Just the second half of this memorandum alone would more than double its GDP. And don't forget that the agreement specifies at least $300 billion. There will be some that say that the money is being used specifically for reconstruction, and that is true. But all that means is that Iran can use its own money in the future for things like, say, building up their military again. It may just be me, but it appears that if an agreement is not reached on the second half of the memorandum, it would be advantageous for the United States. To be sure, a large portion of Iran's military has been either destroyed or depleted, along with many of its leaders and a lot of its infrastructure. But the first half of the memorandum solves for that. With the straits being reopened, the upfront payment, and the new revenue streams Iran will be able to tap into, they will eventually get back to where they were before this all started. But the second half, the half with all the meat on the bone, which, as much as the first half was weighed in Iran's favor, is weighed even that much more, that will be much harder for Trump to sell to the American people and the world. I think they will end up calling returning to the status quo the deal, and then claim victory. I would not be surprised if the second half of this deal just fades into the distance as both sides continuously extend that 60-day limit. That $300 billion is just too hard to justify. And don't get me wrong, I am a huge fan of the Marshall Plan. I think it was incredibly wise and forward-thinking, and it led to untold wealth and prosperity for both Europe and the United States. I think a lot of people, and specifically a lot of people on the right, see the United States spending money on other countries as throwing money into the void. That once the capital is gone, it's gone forever. But that is just not the case. That money generates goodwill that can be capitalized upon at a later time. It builds alliances, which are literally our greatest strength as a nation. It creates job security that leads to the establishment of a specialized workforce that end up becoming manufacturing hubs that drive down the cost of goods and developing new technologies. But most importantly, it saves lives. This deal is no Marshall Plan. It's going to cost twice as much, be delivered to a single country, and be given to the same regime that we started this conflict with. This would be the equivalent of proposing the Marshall Plan with Rudolf Hess in charge of Germany. There are two places in this memorandum: the removal of UN sanctions and in the restricting of Israel in conducting operations against Hezbollah that trample over other nations' sovereignty. You cannot make a deal on behalf of another nation without their knowledge or consent and expect them to honor it. On top of being unenforceable, it is also a bad idea strategically. Specifically, in Israel's case, as you have now handed them incredible leverage over a negotiation that they were not directly a part of before. Our negotiators have put us in a position where a third party can break our agreement on our behalf, meaning that they now have even greater influence over us than they did before. This entire thing, from the start through the negotiations, has been an unmitigated disaster and an utter humiliation.
Mark, mode 1 Charlie. 1 Charlie.
What I'm about to say may sound hyperbolic, but I promise you it isn't. The threat of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz is probably more valuable to Iran than a nuclear weapon. To effectively use a nuclear weapon during negotiation, you have to convince the other party that you are crazy enough to actually use it. And while Iran would undoubtedly be one of the most dangerous nations to acquire a nuclear device, it is still unknown if they would actually go through with using one. This is not so with the closing of the strait. We know very well that they are willing to do it, so a threat of it being done in the future carries much more weight. Even though the repercussions of a nuclear device are more devastating, they are also more permanent. Humans have not lived in a world where a nuclear device has been used in anger when multiple countries had the same capability. We do not know how the world would react. So, in the process of trying to stop Iran from attaining a nuclear device, we have effectively given them something more valuable. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they were seen as one of the most powerful militaries in the world. As time has gone on, while it is clear that the leadership of Russia is an immense threat, day by day, their technology and their equipment prove to be less and less so. This conflict had a similar effect on the United States. We failed to protect our allies in the region, and our air defenses proved to be inefficient and cost-prohibitive. It got so bad that the Gulf states started turning to Ukraine for aid in their defense against drone attacks, to which Ukraine, in the middle of fighting for their lives, said that they would provide support. When the Ukraine war is over, there will be no Western military with as much battle experience and knowledge of actual peer-to-peer modern warfare as the Ukrainians. When it comes to tactics and knowing what is required technologically on the modern battlefield, they will have far surpassed even the United States. To not accept their knowledge or expertise would be the height of arrogance. This conflict should not have happened, but since it did, we should have dominated it. And while we did have undeniable success over the mainland, and the work of our armed forces is still unmatched, we lost 13 lives, and our failure to force the strait open will forever be a humiliation. As a result, we look weaker than we did before this started. We have lost the trust of our allies that we have failed to protect, and we ran through our stockpiles unnecessarily when an escalation with China is undoubtedly right around the corner. According to John Kerry, Secretary of State and former presidential nominee, Netanyahu came to Bush, Obama, and Biden with the same plan to take out Iran. There was only one person who was convinced, and that was Donald Trump, the architect of this colossal failure. The dynamics at play in this deal-making process are that the United States will do almost anything to get out of the horrible mess that it has made, and the Iranian government, who is either acting in good faith but does not have the ability to actually control the actors within its borders, or it's acting in bad faith, knowing that it can simply frame any malfeasance they commit as something done by an outside actor. This allows them to break their side of the deal, to a degree, while still acting as if they are trying to uphold the agreement. There is great danger in seeing Iran as a monolith. The threat of closing Hormuz is a bell that can never be unrung. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that there were no legitimate reasons to go into Iran. I don't think it should have happened, but they were a threat to their own citizens, to the United States, and to our regional allies. Regardless as to whether we achieved any of our stated goals, which were never clearly established, as is typical for this administration, the power that we have given Iran via the threat of closing the strait will go down as one of the most consequential miscalculations of our era. Regardless as to what the Trump administration's supporters say in defense of what has, or I suppose is, happening with Iran, tactical and operational success does not matter if there is no grand strategy. This administration does not plan in decades. They plan in days, sometimes just hours. They do not consider the repercussions of what their actions will be. They run roughshod over everything they come across, if for no other reason than to escape the repercussions of what they ran roughshod over yesterday. There is no plan, and there is no vision. They push and they push up against the limits of decency, the limits of the law, and the limits of our very democracy. And now we have a new sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, one that will haunt us forever.